So we've talked about three advantages of proof-of-stake blockchain protocols. Again, pretty much everybody agrees that those are, in fact, advantages of the proof-of-stake approach. We've talked about three disadvantages. Everybody pretty much agrees that those are indeed disadvantages of the proof-of-stake approach. Lots, of course, disagreement about which of these is more important. Do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages or not? So what I want to do next is touch on two topics which have just created kind of massive confusion. These are two things you hear people debate quite bitterly over in public discourse all the time, but that discourse is often sort of quite confused, in my opinion. Sometimes due to different people using the same term to mean very different things. Sometimes, frankly, just sloppy thinking. Sometimes even bad faith. And so I want to spend some time on these two topics to make sure that you're properly informed, so that when you see these kind of raging debates, you're in a position to form your own opinion. So each of these two questions is going to involve a very loaded term. And the first loaded term is going to be permissionless. Whatever that may mean, if you're a fan of blockchain protocols, this probably sounds like a good thing. So the question then is, one of these two approaches, proof of work versus proof of stake, is one of those fundamentally more permissionless than the other? You will often hear proponents of proof of work say something like all proof of stake blockchain protocols are inherently permissioned. And, at sort of that level of sweeping generality, that kind of statement certainly is false. Right? There's plenty of proof-of-stake blockchain protocols running today where I can just go to some exchange, maybe a centralized exchange like Coinbase, maybe a decentralized exchange like Uniswap. I can very easily acquire some of the coins in the native currency of that protocol. I can start staking, and today I could spin up a node and join a protocol that's already been running for many years. And that is very much not permissioned consensus, right? That's very much not IBM buying 7 servers to replicate a database to boost its uptime. It really is sort of a version of permissionless consensus. So while, in my opinion, it's definitely inaccurate to refer to proof-of-stake blockchain protocols as permissioned, still I want to ask, could there be some sort of grain of truth in this argument? Could there be some sense in which sort of proof-of-stake protocols are a little bit less permissionless than proof-of-work protocols? Well, I can think of two reasons why the answer is technically yes, why proof-of-work and specifically Nakamoto consensus is in some sense an even more extreme form of permissionlessness than what we see in proof-of-stake protocols. That said, I'm not sure either of these two distinctions is particularly important. But let's talk through them and you can judge for yourself. So first, in proof-of-work protocols, or let's say specifically in Nakamoto consensus, it is true that if you're sort of contributing to the protocol, so if you're trying to mine new blocks, the protocol has literally never heard of you until your first success, until the first time you solve one of these hard crypto puzzles and present a block to the rest of the network. Only at that point will the protocol have ever heard of your particular public key. And actually, the only reason it's going to learn your public key then is because presumably you're going to include it in the block so that you can claim your block reward. But even that technically is optional. So this is different from how proof-of-stake protocols work, or at least as we understand them today, right? As we've talked about many times, proof-of-stake, there's going to be some staking contract. If you want to participate in consensus, like contribute to block production, you're going to have to put some native cryptocurrency in escrow in that staking contract. You're going to include with it your public key so that other people sort of can verify your signature when you're signing blocks or votes or whatever. And so that can be viewed as a form of registration. I mean, you're only registering your public key, not anything else about you, but you are registering your public key. So the protocol, and for that matter, anyone else who's paying attention to this publicly visible staking contract, they have actually heard of your public key before you've ever produced any blocks. So that's the sense in which proof-of-stake protocols, at least as we understand them, do seem to require at least some very mild form of registration, which actually you don't even need in Nakamoto consensus. So on that dimension, you could argue proof-of-work protocols are more permissionless than proof-of-stake. Again, not clear to me who's going to care about this distinction, but it is a distinction. A second distinction is that in proof-of-work protocols, or again, let's focus specifically on Nakamoto consensus with block rewards, you can actually acquire your initial coins in the native currency. You can acquire them from the protocol itself rather than from any other counterparty, right? All you have to do is turn on your computer or turn on your ASIC and successfully mine a block, solve a crypto puzzle, collect your block reward, boom, you now have a non-zero balance in that particular cryptocurrency. In a proof of stake protocol, meanwhile, the only way to go from owning no coins to owning a positive number of coins is to buy those coins from some counterparty, which again is typically going to be an exchange like, say, Coinbase or Uniswap. So this is, again, a valid distinction between the two approaches to Sybil resistance. Again, not clear to me in practice this is sort of particularly meaningful. Any proof of stake blockchain protocol that has decent traction is generally going to have reasonable liquidity in sort of your favorite centralized or decentralized exchange, and you'll just be able to get some of those coins without any problem. In fact, it may even be sort of easier to do that than to start meaningfully participating in a proof of work protocol, which may involve, for example, buying some ASICs. So there is, I guess, this kind of extreme failure mode of a proof of stake protocol where, for some reason, like all the coins are being squatted on by like a small number of insiders who are unwilling to sell. Well, then there's going to be no liquidity on any of the exchanges and nobody can join the club, right? If you don't already own some of the coins, you're not going to be able to get any if there's no counterparty that will sell it to you. But if you're in that extreme case, to me, this is kind of a failure of how the protocol was set up at the beginning, not really sort of a problem with proof of stake Sybil resistance per se. So there's lots of ways you can sort of guarantee liquidity, right? So for example, whoever's running the protocol can themselves inject liquidity into exchanges, or there's something known as an airdrop, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which will get coins out to sort of a wide group of people. So yeah, there is this kind of failure mode, but any project that sort of finds itself in it did some things very badly at launch. So in summary, kind of my personal view of this issue, I regard all of the major proof of work blockchains and all of the major proof of stake blockchains as really being permissionless protocols. If you want, I'm willing to grant you that perhaps Nakamoto consensus is at least slightly more permissionless than today's proof of stake protocols. Let me further clarify that this statement is really about the currently deployed major blockchain protocols, right? So the ones that we know about so far, a Nakamoto consensus protocol like Bitcoin is slightly more permissionless in the consensus we discussed than the currently deployed major proof of stake blockchain protocols. Even here, I am not asserting that it's a fundamental distinction between the two approaches to Sybil resistance. That's in fact a really interesting computer science question. Is there some reason why proof of stake fundamentally has to be a little less permissionless in some sense than proof of work? So that is true for the current protocols. Is it true in a more sort of deep sense? I don't know. So moving on to our second controversial question. And if you thought the first one involved a loaded word, namely permissionless, the second one involves probably the most loaded word in the entire world of blockchain protocols, which is decentralization. Again, even not knowing how that might be defined, if you're a fan of blockchain protocols, that sounds like it's got to be a good thing. So you want to ask, is one of proof of work or proof of stake sort of lead to fundamentally more decentralized designs than the other? So ask 20 different researchers in the blockchain space for a definition of decentralization. You'll probably get about 42 different answers. And that's, probably the biggest reason why the sort of public discourse on this topic is as confused as it is. Often people on opposite sides of an argument, they're literally not even talking about the same thing. So what I'm going to do next is walk through sort of a few of the things people most commonly mean when they're talking about decentralization. And for each of those candidate definitions, we'll try to compare proof of work versus proof of stake protocols. Just sort of the TLDR I'll tell you at the outset, which is that, for all of the most common notions of decentralization, as far as I've seen, sort of in my opinion, there's really no clear argument that one of proof of stake or proof of work should be better than the other, even with respect to that fixed definition of decentralization. Now, I'm open to the possibility that there is, in fact, no sort of systematic force making proof of work or proof of stake more decentralized than the other. That's sort of how it would appear to me as things stand today. I'm also open that, proof of work is sort of systematically more decentralized than proof of stake, and just no one's sort of figured out how to argue that. And I'm also open to the reverse, that maybe proof of stake leads to better decentralization fundamentally than proof of work, and it's just nobody's figured out why that's true. I think all of those possible options are in play. But just, as we understand, blockchain protocols right now in early 2023, I know of no convincing argument in favor of one of these two methodologies for any kind of commonly accepted notion of decentralization. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're just talking about a specific pair of protocols that have been out there running in the wild, you may well be able to argue, with respect to sort of some fixed, precise notion of decentralization, you might be able to argue that one of those protocols, at least right now, is currently more decentralized than the other. Okay, so I think there are reasonably convincing arguments out there for specific pairs of protocols and specific notions of of decentralization. But that, keep in mind, is a comparison of protocols. So just because some proof-of-stake blockchain protocol out there in the wild is sort of less decentralized according to some precise definition than some proof-of-work protocol that's out there, that does not mean that proof-of-stake is fundamentally less decentralized than proof-of-work. It's only a statement about the protocols. It's not a statement about those design methodologies. So what would be an example of what someone means when they talk about the degree of decentralization of a blockchain protocol? I'm not going to give you the 42 different answers. I'm going to give you 3 common answers. The first thing you hear a lot about, and this is especially in the Bitcoin and Ethereum communities, is to focus on the minimum computing requirements necessary to follow along with the blockchain protocol and verify its correctness. And to clarify, when I say verifying correctness here, I don't necessarily mean contributing to block production. So like in a proof-of-work protocol, I don't mean that the node has to sort of buy a bunch of ASICs to try to, solve crypto puzzles to create new blocks. I'm only talking about a machine which is watching blocks as they get produced and is checking that actually everything is proceeding as the protocol says it should. And this definition of decentralization really kind of has nothing to do with the choice of the Sybil resistance mechanism, proof of work versus proof of stake. Right? This is really just sort of controlled by, the sort of CPU and memory and storage requirements that it takes to sort of keep up with whatever the rate of transaction processing is by this particular blockchain protocol. For example, Bitcoin famously is quite decentralized with respect to this particular metric. You really do not need a very powerful computer to simply verify the correctness of the progression of the Bitcoin protocol. Again, if you wanted to contribute to block production and actually do the mining, that's a different story. But if you just want to run what's in Bitcoin is called a full node, where you're just sort of following along with the blockchain protocol, that does not require a very expensive computer. But the reason that the Bitcoin protocol scores so well on this measure is not because it's a proof-of-work protocol. That's actually not relevant. It's for 2 reasons. One is its choice of a consensus protocol, the fact that it's using longest chain consensus, which is quite lightweight compared to BFT-type protocols. And then secondly, it's just about parameter selection, right? So in Bitcoin, there's only going to be 1 block every 10 minutes on average, and blocks have size, maybe something like 2 megabytes. And that gives you a sort of transaction processing rate of something like 5 transactions per second. And so that's the reason why it's just not that hard to sort of keep up with the Bitcoin protocol. Nothing to do with proof of work, has everything to do with the slow rate of transaction processing and the fact that different nodes running the protocol don't have to communicate with each other like they would have to in a BFT type protocol. So for example, you could imagine a different version of the Bitcoin protocol, which is exactly the same, still uses proof of work Sybil resistance, still uses longest chain consensus, but we just change the parameters, right? So maybe we have, a block not once every 10 minutes, but, once every 5 minutes, and maybe blocks can be like 20 megabytes instead of 2 megabytes. All of a sudden, right, it's still a proof of work protocol, still looks a lot like Bitcoin, but now all of a sudden it's going to be much less decentralized with respect to this particular definition of that term. You're going to need a much beefier machine to handle the sort of, 20x amount of transaction processing required by that variant of the Bitcoin protocol. And similarly, maybe you have in mind some sort of well-known proof-of-stake blockchain protocols that score poorly on this particular measure of decentralization, that actually, require sort of very beefy, very expensive machines to participate in the validation of the blockchain protocol. But again, the reason those protocols are not decentralized with respect to this metric, it's not because they're using proof-of-stake Sybil resistance. It's because of the choice of consensus protocols, so like a BFT type protocol, which requires much more coordination between the different nodes that are running the protocol, plus the selection of parameter choices. So for example, the protocols you have in mind probably have a very fast block rate. So for example, if you think about Cardano, which we mentioned briefly at the end of part 3 is the canonical example of a proof-of-stake longest chain blockchain protocol. That's a proof-of-stake protocol that is quite decentralized according to this metric. And again, that's because of its choice of a consensus protocol. It's using longest chain consensus rather than BFT-type consensus, and because of its parameter choices. It's just not having blocks all that frequently, and for that reason, nodes just do not have to be that powerful to keep up with that particular blockchain. So summarizing, what makes blockchain protocols more or less decentralized according to this particular criterion, it's really not Sybil resistance. That's really just not important at all. It's really about sort of the choice of the consensus protocol and then how aggressively or conservatively you set parameters, in particular, the rate of transaction processing. Now let's move on to a second, totally different thing that people sometimes mean when they talk about the decentralization of a blockchain protocol, namely the evenness of the distribution of the cryptocurrency hosted by that protocol. So first, let me make two general comments. So first of all, honestly, we just haven't had that much time to watch the evolution of proof-of-stake blockchain protocols. Most of the major ones have been around for only a few years. So even if there is a systematic difference on this notion of decentralization between proof-of-work and proof-of-stake protocols, I just don't think we've had time to accumulate the evidence that would suggest that. So that's the first caveat. Second comment is that, in my opinion at least, I don't think it's fair to really expect cryptocurrencies to be somehow like super evenly distributed. Right, the reality is just that wealth concentrates, and it's kind of a law of nature. Whether you like it or don't like it, it just seems like a very powerful force. I'm sure you've heard about the Pareto distribution. It shows up in all kinds of different phenomena, and in particular in income distributions and in a wide range of different societies. So I don't see any reason, why we'd expect cryptocurrencies to be more evenly distributed than, let's say, the fiat currency of some modern democracy. Now, for the optimists out there, I definitely don't want to discourage you. If you actually think you can use blockchain protocols and cryptocurrencies to have a more fair income distribution, more power to you. I just don't want to set that up as somehow like a prerequisite for this technology being successful. The cryptocurrencies wind up mirroring fiat currencies in modern democracies. I want to view that as like, okay, that's, sort of as good as we could have expected. What does make sense to worry about is somehow through poor design decisions, increasing the concentration of wealth, exacerbating income inequality, because of the way that we design a blockchain protocol. And so this is what we're going to be on the lookout for when we start probing proof of work and proof of stake protocols with respect to this particular decentralization measure. Now, when we talk about how evenly distributed the currency distribution is, we should sort of separate out two things. So first of all, just the initial distribution and whether or not that's reasonably even. And then separately, the sort of dynamics over time. How does the distribution evolve as the blockchain protocol runs for, say, some number of years? You might hope that even if you started with sort of an unfair distribution, dynamics over time would somehow lead you back to a more fair one. We're going to be more kind of concerned about the opposite. The worry is that even though you sort of initially distribute coins in a reasonable way, the way you designed your blockchain protocol somehow, sort of drives you toward excessive concentration of wealth. That's what we're going to be worried about. So let's start by talking about the initial distribution. And here a kind of very interesting and really almost unique case study would be the Bitcoin protocol, which quite unusually launched just with the all zero initial distribution. So there were literally no Bitcoins in existence when the protocol launched. Literally every Bitcoin in existence today is created as part of a block reward from some block, which is currently on the longest chain of the Bitcoin blockchain. Now, it's easy to imagine a minor variation of the Bitcoin protocol where everything is exactly the same, except as part of the Genesis block, there is a provision of a non-zero number of Bitcoins to various addresses. So just a version of Bitcoin that has an initial distribution that's non-zero, with then further Bitcoins being created as usual through block rewards. And indeed, if you think through what it would take to successfully launch an ambitious new proof-of-work blockchain project right now, like speaking in 2023, it's hard to imagine how you do that without some kind of non-zero initial distribution of the native currency. It's hard to imagine how you would garner much interest in the project, given how many other blockchain protocols are out there without a non-zero distribution. So I don't think it's realistic for new blockchain protocols, be they proof of work or proof of stake, to aspire to Bitcoin's kind of, all zero initial distribution. I think it's a little much to ask for. But I do think it's reasonable for projects to aspire towards some kind of reasonably fair initial distribution of their native cryptocurrency. For example, by making sure that when the protocol launches, there's many, many stakeholders that have some amount of that cryptocurrency. So the initial distribution of a cryptocurrency, whether it's kind of, happens at the time that the protocol launches or whether it's sort of added in later on, that's something known as an airdrop. And so again, the goal of this airdrop is to get this new cryptocurrency into the hands of lots of different people who then hopefully will be invested in the success of the protocol. And in practice, you also have to expect some of that initial distribution will be going, for example, to the members of the team that sort of launched the protocol, to the early investors, and so on. Airdrops are quite tricky to get right, in particular because of the issue of symbols. Like, how do you know the two different addresses really correspond to two different people? So there's a lot we could say about better and worse ways to sort of carry out airdrops. That's a little bit outside the scope of this lecture, so we'll save that for another day. So summarizing, the problem of having a reasonably fair initial distribution of a new cryptocurrency, say one launching in 2023, that problem is really independent of your choice of your Sybil resistance mechanism. It's really exactly the same problem you face, whether it's going to be a proof of work blockchain protocol or a proof of stake one. So moving on to the evolution of the currency distribution over time. And again, here, what we're particularly concerned about is, could it be that, a protocol starts with a reasonably good airdrop, so a reasonably even distribution of the cryptocurrency, but then because of how the protocol works, kind of wealth concentrates. And again, you got to expect wealth to concentrate to some degree, but is there some sort of, are there protocol design decisions that would exacerbate the income inequality more than you would otherwise have? And for this question, honestly, at this point, we just really have no idea. One reason is that even, if you snapshot a particular moment in time, it can actually be quite tricky to understand exactly how evenly distributed a currency is because of the Sybil problem, because you don't know whether two different addresses actually represent the same entity or not. So even for a fixed currency at a fixed moment in time, it's sort of tricky to assess sort of how even it is. And then secondly, as far as the dynamics over time, we just don't have that much data. We just haven't been watching these blockchain protocols for very long. Maybe 5 years out, we'll be able to say, hopefully, much more about this topic. There is one common point of confusion that I do want to sort of address head on. Sometimes you hear people say that proof of stake protocols for this measure of decentralization fare poorly, arguing that the staking rewards kind of setup means that the rich get richer. So that's really not correct. So let me sort of unpack that a little bit. We talked a bit about staking rewards back in the staking mechanics video back in part 1. And as discussed there, staking rewards are usually given out as a percentage of your stake. So it's really just like an interest payment. So in the same way that if you have sort of double the money in your bank account, you're going to be getting double the interest rate. If you have double the stake in a typical proof of stake protocol, you're going to be getting double the staking rewards. So while it is true that in absolute terms, the size of your staking reward gets bigger as the size of your stake gets bigger, as far as the staking distribution, if you think about a world where sort of everybody's staking, or at least everybody's sort of delegating so that they get their share of the staking rewards, if everybody's getting their share of the staking rewards, the income distribution, the currency distribution stays exactly the same. Okay, so if you have 1% of it, and then you get a 2% interest rate, but the other 99% of the stake also gets a 2% interest rate, you will again have 1% of the resulting stake distribution. Right, and this makes sense because the point of the staking rewards is to basically sort of reimburse stakers for the opportunity cost that they're suffering. Right, they've chosen to sort of take this sort of economically valuable asset, put it in escrow in this blockchain protocol, as opposed to, for example, cashing out and sort of putting it in a bank, right? So there's an opportunity cost of having it locked up. They deserve to be compensated. That's what the staking rewards do. The opportunity cost is sort of, scaling with the size of your stake, right? Double the stake, that's double the opportunity cost that you're suffering in the outside world. So naturally, you should be getting double the staking reward to combat that. And again, it does not make the rich get richer. It leaves the staking distribution exactly the same. There are some edge cases around this, right? Like, for example, if you were only eligible for staking rewards, if you already had a sufficiently large amount of stake, that would actually be a force driving a little bit toward extra income inequality. For most of the major proof-of-stake blockchain protocols, there are sort of delegation programs that do allow basically anybody to participate and earn their fair share of the staking rewards. So as long as the protocol has that property, again, if everybody's staking or everybody's delegating, basically that income distribution is going to be remaining exactly the same. So the final measure of decentralization that I want to discuss is how even the distribution of control over the protocol is. Now, for a proof of stake protocol, the second and third criteria are pretty close to being the same thing. Right? The main difference is that for the second measure, you're talking about all of the currency, whether it be in the staking contract or not. Whereas in the third one, right, control of the protocol, that comes from the stake specifically in the staking contract. So you're talking more about the distribution of that. But still, kind of, morally more or less the same. With a proof of work protocol, the second and third criteria are really quite distinct, right? So the middle one is about the native currency of the protocol, and the last one, the third one, is really about the distribution of the hash rate of people contributing blocks to the protocol. So in the proof of stake case, here we'd be worried about undue concentration of wealth. We've already talked a lot about that. In the proof of work setting, what we'd be worried about is undue concentration of hash rate. And in practice, proof of work protocols, including, for example, Bitcoin, you really do see concentration of hash rate. You definitely do see a few really big players. So presumably, kind of one reason for this is economies of scale, which come in like in various ways. Right. For example, ASICs need to be kept cool, right? And so, maybe if you're sort of a big enough player, you can just sort of build your own big warehouse with a special cooling system that can very cheaply keep a whole bunch of ASICs cool. And that would be an advantage over anyone who's just sort of buying one ASIC and sort of running it in their bedroom. Similarly, like you could even imagine, someone's business is in fact to manufacture ASICs, right? So they're obviously going to be getting them themselves more cheaply than what anyone would get those ASICs for on the open market. So in proof-of-stake protocols, we do indeed see concentration of wealth and therefore concentration in this third sense. But in proof-of-work protocols, we also see concentration of hash rate, which again is kind of, doing poorly on this third measure. And again, just between the lack of data and just the sort of permissionless environment where you have symbols and it's hard to tell, kind of who owns what, very tricky to make some kind of direct comparison between these two. So again, maybe there is some systematic difference. Maybe proof of work or proof of stake is better than the other on this third point. But at the moment, there's really kind of no way to make a convincing argument either way. So like with the first two notions of decentralization, no clear winner between proof of stake or proof of work. To muddy the waters even further, I should at least briefly mention the existence of mining pools in the case of proof of work protocols and staking pools in the case of proof of stake protocols. So the basic idea of a mining pool, kind of exactly what you'd think. You've got small miners, so each of them has a small amount of hash rate left to their own devices. They would find a block only very infrequently, right? Maybe once a year or something like that. And so rather than having these kind of like very infrequent and uncertain payouts, a bunch of small miners band together and agree to share block rewards that any of them earn amongst the pool. And, the benefit from a miner's perspective is sort of clear. You get much steadier payouts. So rather than getting a full block reward, once a year, maybe you're going to be getting something like, 10% of the block reward, but closer to something like once a month. So mining pools are definitely a thing. And actually, they've been a big part of the Bitcoin ecosystem for over a decade. And some of the pools can be quite big. Like it's not uncommon to see a mining pool where the combined hash rate within the pool is something like 20% of the total hash rate that's being devoted to the Bitcoin protocol. So when mining pools get pretty big, some people get pretty nervous because that would at least have the optics of being a concentration of hash rate. Now, honestly, something which is really unclear is, for the purposes of decentralization, like this third metric we're talking about, should a mining pool with, 10,000 miners and 20% of the overall hash rate, should we think of that more as if it was a single miner, just a massive one with 20% of the overall hash rate? Or should we really regard it as sort of a collection of kind of, uncoordinated and presumably harmless small miners? And honestly, it's really not clear which of those viewpoints is sort of more accurate or more helpful. The answer probably sort of depends on, things like switching costs, right? So if you have like 20% of the hash rate and all of that hash rate is stuck there because they're in some kind of long-term contractual agreement, then that starts feeling more like some kind of actual cartel acting as sort of a single entity with lots of hash rate. Whereas if sort of individual miners can just sort of very freely switch between sort of any mining pools they want whenever they want, then maybe it seems more okay to sort of treat these pools as really just a collection of small miners. So proof-of-stake protocols have their own kind of version of mining pools. It's a little bit different, but largely in the same spirit. Something known as staking pools. That's for the case for protocols like Ethereum, which do not support in-protocol delegation. Then, as we discussed back in part 1 in the staking mechanics video, if there's no in-protocol delegation, you should expect kind of an external market to appear, and that's what's happened in the Ethereum ecosystem. Other proof-of-stake protocols do allow in-protocol delegation, and so then those are, that's kind of playing the role of the staking pools for those particular proof-of-stake chains. So either way, whether you're talking about staking pools or in-protocol delegation, this is basically something like validation as a service, right? So the customer here would be someone who already owns the relevant cryptocurrency and moreover is perfectly happy to put that cryptocurrency in escrow in exchange for a share of the staking rewards. Okay, fine, you say. Then, it's a permissionless blockchain protocol, whatever. Just become a validator, put up your stake, and earn your staking rewards. What's the big deal? But, keep in mind that to be a validator and to earn your staking rewards, you have a list of requirements that you have to meet, right? So first of all, you actually have to, run the protocol, right? You need to have a machine. You need to make sure it's running the latest and greatest version of the protocol software. You need to have a sufficiently good network connection to kind of follow along with the protocol, etc. You have to operate a node. Secondly, depending on the protocol you're talking about, there may also be some minimum requirement for how much you have to stake. Proof of stake Ethereum famously requires 32 ETH, which is actually like a lot of money, 32 ETH in order to become a validator. So you can imagine people who, on the one hand, do own some of the relevant cryptocurrency and are happy to put it in escrow in exchange for staking rewards, but who do not meet some of those other requirements. Maybe it's someone who either cannot or doesn't want to run a node and keep it up to date and make sure the network connection is really good. Maybe it's someone who doesn't have 32 ETH, but maybe they have 16 ETH or they have 3 ETH. Or whatever. So these are people that it would be great if you could sort of bring them into the fold and have them contribute their cryptocurrency to help secure the protocol, even though they don't meet all of the requirements you would need to get the staking rewards. So for all of these reasons, staking pools and in protocol delegation, they're very natural ideas, even inevitable. Some would probably argue. I think most people view them as sort of a net positive. That said, it's still hard to know how to think about them from the perspective of decentralization, and specifically this third measure that we're talking about, sort of the evenness and distribution over control over the protocol. For example, imagine you had a single staking pool controlling 60% of the cryptocurrency that's in the staking contract, right? Sounds like that's a disaster for decentralization, right? Sounds like basically, you're totally failing on this third measure. But then suppose I told you further that, 60% of the stake is participating in the staking pool, but all the staking pool is actually doing is acting as a matchmaker, right? So just matching people who have capital and don't want to run a node with people who actually are happy to operate a node. If all the staking pool is doing is facilitating these kinds of matches, actually doesn't matter if 60% of the stake is participating in it. Maybe that just means we're getting sort of a more efficient outcome. So I don't have any answers for you to these questions. I mean, these are really things that the research community is sort of actively thinking about, literally as we speak. But one takeaway I do want you to have is that even after you've committed to what seems to be a pretty precisely defined notion of decentralization, even then, if you sort of look at the full ecosystem, it can actually be quite hard to assess how decentralized or not a given protocol is with respect to your seemingly precisely defined measure. To give you a really concrete example, one thing you hear about a lot in the context of this third measure is the Nakamoto coefficient of a blockchain protocol. And so the Nakamoto coefficient is defined as the minimum number of distinct parties that would have to collude in order to disrupt the basic consistency and liveness properties of a blockchain protocol. So if you're talking about like Nakamoto consensus, you're talking about sort of how many distinct parties would have to collude before amongst them they control 51% of the hash rate. For sort of a proof of stake BFT style protocol, the Nakamoto coefficient would be the minimum number of distinct entities that need to collude before they jointly control 34% of the cryptocurrency. On the surface, that sounds like it's sort of a proper mathematical definition, but sort of the devil's in the details of what you mean by entity, distinct entities, right? So a staking pool or a mining pool, is that a single entity or is it a whole bunch of different entities, right? So even just something as like evaluating the Nakamoto coefficient of your favorite blockchain protocol is actually kind of, fraught with peril and controversy. So to summarize this whole decentralization discussion, and I apologize, this summary is going to be kind of unsatisfying. But so first of all, many people just have trouble even reaching agreement on what decentralization should mean. As we said, ask 20 different people for a definition of that word, and you're going to get 42 different answers. Second, among these competing definitions, right, we talked about 3, but there's lots of others as well. It's frankly just not super clear which of those are the most practically relevant, which ones we really should be focusing on, for example, that really matter for mainstream adoption of this technology. And the answer there may well be quite nuanced. It really may be, it depends on what type of application you're thinking of supporting that then sort of suggests which notion of decentralization you should be focusing on. And finally, as we discussed, for any of the most common notions of decentralization, there is no obvious intrinsic advantage to choosing proof of work or proof of stake Sybil resistance. So it should be clear at this point that on the one hand, decentralization is kind of a higher level concept, is fundamental to the vision of blockchain protocols. On the other hand, it should also be clear that we haven't really figured out the right ways to think about it yet. So I would expect to remain decentralization to remain front and center in the various debates we're going to be having over this technology for the next decade at least. So moving on to kind of a meta summary of this comparison between proof of work and proof of stake Sybil resistance, right? We talked about 3 relatively uncontroversial advantages of proof of stake: less energy consumption, better latency and finality guarantees, and the possibility of slashing to recover from 51% type attacks. We talked about 3 relatively uncontroversial disadvantages of the proof of stake approach, or at least, as we understand it today, if you look at today's major proof of stake protocols, in the form of additional complexity, additional attack vectors, and stronger trust assumptions. And as we've sort of seen, those 3 different disadvantages are all kind of connected to each other. And of course, it is controversial whether the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, but the good news is you're now in a position to have your own informed opinion on that matter. We then discussed 2 heavily loaded words, right? Permissionless and decentralized. We talked a bit about what those words might actually mean to various people. And we observed that, at least speaking now in 2023, there's no real convincing argument that one of proof of work or proof of stake, one of those approaches, is fundamentally better with respect to either of those 2 criteria. So overall, the picture is fairly complex and nuanced, and definitely reasonable people can sort of disagree about the current state of proof of stake blockchain protocols. The most sort of risk-averse and conservative people out there, I think it's a reasonable position to just sort of stick with, maybe Nakamoto consensus and specifically focus on Bitcoin just because it's sort of so battle-tested and relatively simple. On the other hand, you have to concede that the proof of stake approach really does have the momentum. There really has been a strong migration toward that approach over the last 5 years. So as with so many other things in the blockchain space, it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out over the coming years, right? Will sort of proof of stake retain its position as the dominant approach to Sybil resistance? Will proof of work enjoy some kind of renaissance? Will some third approach to Sybil resistance supplant proof of stake as the dominant approach? I really have no idea, and I'm excited to find out. So with that, I want to congratulate you. You've made it to the end of this very long lecture number 12. Why was it so long? Well, the topic, right, proof of stake blockchain protocols, meaning permissionless consensus, coupled with proof of stake Sybil resistance. That's on the one hand one of the most important and central topics, and on the other hand one of the most just technically challenging topics in all of foundations of blockchains. And if you've watched all of these videos, you are now in very rarefied company. You now understand this topic more deeply than pretty much anyone on the planet who's not actively building these protocols themselves. So give yourself a pat on the back, get a good night's sleep, and I'll see you in the next lecture, lecture number 13, where we're going to talk about the economic security of blockchain protocols. I'll see you there.